Okay guys, so I'm going to feed my worms. I don't really know how this view is going to work. I just have my camera on my tripod. But today, I'm going to be feeding them blended pumpkin from Halloween, I think. It was in my freezer. So, one of the tips I have if you're going to be doing vermicomposting or having a worm bin is to definitely blend your food because it's easier for the worms to digest it. You can definitely put whole food in, but the worms like food when it starts going bad and starting to rot. So it's just easier for the worms to digest the food once it starts going bad if it's blended. So this is a Worm Factory 360 that I have set up. It only has one tray, but once it fills up, there's going to be multiple trays, and the worms will just travel up when the food supply is up at the top. So the first thing I do is I take the lid, and I take off the newspaper layer, and I put it on the lid just because it's an easy spot for it to go while I'm doing this. Okay, so now you can see that I have some pretty good compost going, vermicompost. I usually feel it a little bit to make sure that it's not too wet. And you definitely don't want to feed your worms until the food from your previous feeding is already gone. And this looks just about right. So, what I do is I take this little garden tool and I scrape the compost. Oh, as you can see, there's still compost from my last feeding. So, the worms are actually still eating that. There's not too much though, which is fine. I usually feed them about once a week, which has been going well, but this week it took them a little longer to eat what I had given them, which isn't bad. Yeah, I'm gonna feed them. So what you do is you dig a trench, and one of the tips that I've found is when you feed your worms, you're going to want to feed them 2 or 3 times on one side so the worms travel and eat all the food on that side, and then you'll want to switch it to the other side after a little bit, so then they'll travel to the other side of the bin and you get a good rotation of the vermicompost. So once you dig a little trench, you're going to want to take a handful of shredded newspaper. And the reason you want shredded newspaper is to give a layer of absorption, because when you blend the food, it is obviously pretty wet. And you just want a layer of absorption to keep it in your compost. The rest will drain off down at the bottom. This Worm Factory 360 has a bin at the bottom that collects the liquid. So, after you put a layer of the paper, you're going to want to take your food. I keep mine in Ziploc bags and freeze them, just because it's easier that way for me to collect the food. And then you're just going to pour it down like so. Okay, now before we go on, I just want to give you a little information about worms in general. When they eat the food, there's no way for their bodies to digest it. We have stomach acid to break down the food. Worms don't, so you're going to want to give them some sort of grit. And what I use is, if I can get it in the shot right here, is, anyway, it's all natural oyster shell, crushed oyster shells. And you're just going to want to sprinkle your grit on top of the food, so when they eat the food, they'll also be getting that grit, and the grit will work its way through the worm and break down the food. So you're just going to want a good, generous layer of grit. And then you're just going to want to cover up your food with the worms that you took off to begin with. Now, one tip I have is you're going to want to make sure that there's no contact with the air, the food and the air. You're going to want to make sure that it's completely, I don't want to say packed, but completely covered, because if you have contact with the air, it's going to start smelling. You shouldn't be having any rotten smell with the worm bin, because the worms eat it, and you just shouldn't be having that. Looks pretty good. So, this is going to be the point where you're going to want to check to make sure your compost is wet enough, and if it's not, you're going to want to spray it down. I keep a water bottle next to my bin at all times to spray it down. So once you have it covered, you're going to want to just make sure the worms are still in the bin. Then you're going to want to take your newspaper that you took off and put it on top, and take your water bottle, and I always spray the newspaper and make sure it's damp at all times, because worms breathe through their bodies, and when they feel moisture, they come up to the surface, which is why when it rains, you see worms on the ground. So I'm just going to spray it generously. The newspaper will absorb the water, and yeah, I check it periodically to make sure that there's no food in contact with the air. I make sure the worms are eating, and then I'm going to pick the camera up for a sec. Down at the bottom is the collection bin that I was talking about for the liquid. After a little bit, the liquid will start collecting at the bottom of the collection bin, and you're going to want to empty that out. This model has a collection bin. Yeah, my worm farm probably has, I'd say, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 worms, more or less. They reproduce pretty quickly as long as you keep them fed. And there's that. Worm feeding 101 with the Worm Factory 360. Eventually, once they eat all the food, you can harvest the vermicompost and use it in your garden. I started doing this because of my coffee plant. It needs nutrients, and I wanted to go organic and do it myself, because I'm going to be drinking from this plant eventually. But just a few tips. Worms like greens, they like fruit, They don't really do well with citrus. Don't put orange, anything orange or citrusy in your bin. No meat, no dairy. Onions aren't really that good for them. Starchy things like potatoes aren't really that good. But the more you do it, the more you'll figure out what the worms do and don't like. So keep up the good work for any of you worm farmers out there. If you guys need worms for fishing, let me know. I have a ton of them. Have a good day.